All right. Well, welcome everybody to the sixth Bible study of this first season where we are focusing on Genesis. And tonight we're going to wrap up this first season. We're going to take a couple weeks off after this. And tonight we're going to cover 4 verses, and that's it. Now, having said that, there's other things baked into the entire conversation, but our primary emphasis textually is on Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. And normally, I like to ask the question of if you have any questions that we can catch up on. But what I would rather do tonight is save that towards the end so that we can have a longer time to ask questions that kind of perhaps help us wrap up this entire first series that we've done together. So like I said, we will do tonight's Bible study, then we'll take off about 3 or 4 weeks. And in the next week or two, I will send out a confirmation precisely when we will resume and what the content will be. I don't think it's much of a surprise that the content will be some manner of continuation of Genesis. So the question will be we'll have a question at the end regarding pacing, but let's not stop yet. So it seems like I know everybody on here, and therefore you kind of have access to when I send out an email saying, or post it on Facebook or whatever, you all have access to hear when we will begin again. That's not going to be a surprise for any of you. I think that seems plausible given who I see in the room so far. All right, excellent. If anyone is concerned, or if anybody is not here that you know needs to know about this, be sure to let them know so that we can encourage people to come as it's as appropriate. Okay, so let's talk about Genesis 6 verses 1 through 4. And because this is only 4 verses, it might actually take me longer to summarize it than it would to read it. So what we're going to do is simply read this and then we will begin. So I will go ahead and share the screen. Okay. Would somebody volunteer to read these 4 verses? And as you can see, there's not even any scrolling we have to do to capture it all. Kiri, are you up for it tonight?
I am. I just have to move you. Oh, okay, maybe I can do this. So when man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown."
Excellent. Wonderful. That's weird, right? It's not just me? Okay, good. I love the weird stuff in the Bible because it reminds us that like this is a real document from real people who were engaging whatever it is their weird culture had. And this is the reminder that like life isn't smooth. We've got a lot of baggage in our world that in 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 years, people will look at us and be like, how is that a concern of theirs? I don't understand. So for me, the weirdness makes it highly relatable as a document. And it makes me want to understand and sympathize with these people more and more as I get to understand it better. Some people suggest that this, let me see who it is. I don't think I've mentioned it yet. I believe it's Gordon Wenham in the Word Biblical Commentary, so I often like to mention commentaries that are helpful. This is a particularly good one that's slightly conservative in its take. And Wenham suggests, for instance, that this passage doesn't run just 1 through 4, but rather runs 1 through 8. Now, he's kind of alone in that breaking down of what the unit is. He kind of acknowledges actually that it's 1 to 4 and 5 to 8, but he seems to suggest that 1 to 8 really works as a nice unit. But most people kind of take 5 and start pushing it off to the rest of the flood narrative. It's not a big deal either way, but one of the things we try to do when we're looking at scripture is to think about what natural units of scripture are and not make arbitrary divisions. We don't want to stop a text just because it's convenient for us to do so, or to start one at a place that is convenient and ignore material. In many ways, that has not been a huge issue for what we've done in these first 6 weeks, because we're kind of dealing with units that more or less correspond to chapters. But there are times when where you start and stop your unit makes a difference to the understanding of the passage. So while it's not been a big deal for us yet, we always want to set, fall back on good practices. So as long as we're talking about good practices, let me ask the question here, which is asking of you, what's going on here? Or what questions do you have just from reading those first 4 verses? And without answering them, I just want to kind of surface some of these topics that might be there if you were being inquisitive about these first 4 verses.
Who are the sons of God, and how are they seeing these women? What do they mean by attractive? How did they take them? You have some
okay, that's good. So a lot of your questions, Chris, 4 very good questions. Ironically, like almost all 4 of them are located only in verse 2. It's a very interesting verse.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, questions that come from other places, or maybe a different take on something that happens in verse 2. Does anyone have a question?
So this idea of the Spirit of God being in them or in anybody, like that's always something I pay attention to. Anytime I read it in the Bible, I will send my spirit, whatever it is. So the Spirit of God, ?
Yeah, Spirit of God, ? That's good.
And the specific of 120 years.
120 years. Yeah, well, like why? That's a very specific number, yeah. Okay.
Is verse 3 a punishment for what happened in verse 2? Because it seems like it, but
right.
But you don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. Is it a punishment? Okay. So we're going to dig into some of these things. Are there any other questions before I move on? But don't let me miss any of those questions that you raised. I think all of those things are part of what I want to address tonight. But if I don't get it quickly enough or in the right spot, make sure to raise your hand.
The before and after remark, talking about their existence or whatnot.
The before, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah. I am talking about something that's adjacent to that. So if I don't quite hit it right, addressing your question, like let's be sure to hold on there when we get there. Okay, so then.
One more.
Yes, please.
The word mortal.
Mortal. Where is that? Which one?
At least in the NIV, it's in verse 3. My spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal, is what my translation says.
Yeah, okay. Right, so the one you read for us was the ESV. That's what I had pulled up. NRSV suggests mortals. Let's look at NASB if we've got it available quickly. I know it's here somewhere. There it is. It says flesh in the NASB, the New American Standard Bible. So the two choices that we've seen in the four that we quickly assessed was flesh or mortals. And we will kind of address why that is.
Yeah, so a question. In verse 4, it talks of heroes that were of old and warriors renowned. So are there like stories of Jewish Hercules out there? Like in other like texts?
Not exactly.
Okay.
But this idea is out there. And don't let me not answer that question later.
Okay.
Okay. So these are some of the questions. And in fact, the reason I'm doing this is because where it is important to start when you engage any biblical text, especially one where you're trying to understand it in a deep sort of way, you stop and ask questions of the text before you have somebody give you the answers, right? It is important when you are investigating a text, not to just go, I don't know what that means, therefore somebody tell me. Because what that ends up doing is, more or less, you believe the first thing you read. I mean, maybe not necessarily, but there's a good chance that the first thing you read skews your interpretation of it far more than anything else ever would. And so what you do is you ask the questions in order to set a framework of what is something you're interested in. Ideally, you would slow down and also kind of think about what your answer might be, even if all you ever do is hold it loosely. Because the idea is that you establish a framework so that you can bounce other ideas off of it. Like I said, otherwise you just kind of believe what you read. And so a good practice in Bible study is to, one, identify the boundaries of the passage that you're looking at. And then as you're reading it, start to think, what are the things that are bothering me about this passage? Or not even bothering me, could be bothering me, or, whoa, what's that mean? Or how should I understand that? You know, when I'm doing classes that are like about exegetical methods, which is this idea of how do you get meaning out of the text? How do you exegete the text? One of the things that I emphasize is trying to understand it on its own terms, and not just swallowing something wholesale. I think I've lost my train of thought on one of the other parts of that. You know, when you have like three thoughts going, I had one, I was getting there, I lost it. We'll come back to that. But long story short is, when you're exegeting a text, you're trying to understand it on its own terms, but you have to set a framework of expectations so that you're not just, there it is. I got it. Setting the framework of expectations. Here we go. Yes. Okay. So for anyone who has taken Hebrew with me, for instance, Megan, you took Hebrew with me? Yeah. I used to say one of the best reasons to learn Hebrew is this: not to read Hebrew. I know that sounds really counterintuitive, but the issue of learning Hebrew is that when you engage the text, it forces you to slow down. And it forces you to ask why. Why this? Why that? Because Hebrew not being anybody in this room's native language, you don't have the same automatic connections that you have when you read English. You think, I read English, I understand English. I've read this passage and I know English, therefore I know what it means, which is a false assumption. When you're reading it in another language that you don't know as your first language, you slow down and think, what does that word mean? Even if it's a fairly basic word like spirit or flesh, or like, what are the connotations of the word flesh in Hebrew that may or may not exist in English? Even if there's a really good overlap, the fact that you stopped to ask the question is the benefit. And so that's part of exegeting the text that I want to emphasize, right? So this whole idea of understanding a text starts with this question of, if I could give you one piece of advice, I would say this: try and read the text like you're a toddler. What do I mean by that? Ask the question why over and over again, like you know toddlers do. Why is that? Why? This, somebody tells you this means that. Well, then you ask the question, why does it mean that? And you just dig as much as you can, and that helps you start to unpack the way a passage goes. Okay, so enough rambling from me. Let me ask this. For anyone who has done any sort of Bible study with me previously or on your own, or has done exegetical methods, how do you think I would suggest to begin examining this passage? Like, what sort of things are on my mind as I'm examining the passage?
I have a response. I just don't want to be wrong.
No, it's okay if you're wrong. I mean, like,
what happened before this text?
Okay, so let me, when you say what happened before, do you mean historically or literarily?
Oh, well, I did mean literarily, but now I mean historically.
Well, actually, you know what? Both are right. So that was right. That was me kind of twisting the needle a little bit, right? Because they're both right answers. In fact, that's usually the first thing I ask is, what is its literary context?
So what I'm hearing you tell me that if I was playing Family Feud, I would have been successful. I understand.
That's right. That's right. If I had that awesome Steve Harvey mustache, I would have been like, I don't know exactly if he's got a catchphrase or something, but but yay, you did well. Okay. Ding, ding, ding. Survey says. Okay. So the literary context is huge, and it is actually the first question I typically ask. This passage, where is it sitting? What follows it? What precedes it? And then the kind of little question that is important is, like, how is it related to them? Like, is this a new beginning? So it's not related directly to the stuff, like it's trying to set a new scene, or is it intimately connected to the previous one? Similarly on the back end, is it intimately connected, or is it like, does it end here? Okay.
I have a question.
1 second, Billy Joy. Let me say one more part of this, right? And then the question is simply, even if it seems to be connected in some way or another, does it fit well, or do you kind of see the rough edges to it? So it's kind of like, where does it sit in the literary text that it exists? So that's usually the first thing I engage. Billy Joy, your question.
So if chapter 5 is not like narrative, and before that it was narrative, so it's like narrative and then begat, and it comes back to narrative, and it seems like that is a pretty important. I don't think it would be that important in English, but when it happens in the Bible, it seems like there's always a standout, like the prayer of Jabez, whatever that name is,
right,
because in that it's reverse. It's like begat, story, begat, and so like the story was something to pay attention to.
Yeah, that's a good way to attend to a text. Oh, I get this whole series of something. It changes the pattern for a second. Oh, it wants to catch my attention. And this is an important element that we're going to get to. So yes, chapter 5 really does seem to begin something new when it starts with the genealogy of basically Seth. Now,
is there a name for that?
Well, let's see. At the beginning of chapter 5, I believe, let's see. So in Hebrew, it's known as the Toldot formula, which is to say, these are the generations of, right? And so that's a very common way of beginning something. And while it is a genealogy that is not precisely narrative, it often is that big chunk that begins something, or is like the preamble to a narrative.
I was thinking more of the difference between going between the Togo and then narrative and then back and forth. Does that switch back and forth have a name?
In this case,
like the cryo.
Right. So in this case, no. What we get is the the listing of the genealogy of Seth in chapter 5 in order to set up what comes next. So it's a little bit awkward at the beginning of 6:1, but that slight awkwardness is what catches our attention. But it's not, but they are connected in a certain way. Okay? We'll unpack that a little bit more in a moment.
Yeah, thank you.
You bet. You bet.
And can you type or someone type Tolgoat?
Toldote.
Okay,
There we go.
thank you.
Yes. Okay, so that's usually one of the first questions I ask. What's another question I ask when I'm investigating a passage?
Is it what is like the culture of this time, and meaning like how old, where in the line of everything this comes?
Yeah, so one of the questions I ask is, what is the social context, broadly speaking, at this moment? Like, what are my expectations for what society looks like? So sometimes that is an important question. Sometimes it is not terribly important. But I at least ask the question, what am I looking at? Along those lines, that I like to tie these three things together, right? What is the social context? What is the historical context? So to tie back to Kiri's comment. And then what is the religious context? And it's a little bit like, if you're trying to pick the right color for your font in Word and you have those little sliders, a little bit more red, a little bit more blue, a little bit more green or whatever. It's like sliders, how much does social matter on this one? Does social matter a lot? Does history matter a little? Does religious matter in the middle? Something like that. Like, it's different for every passage, but I'm at least trying to attend to those questions, or at least bring it up as a possibility for investigation. Now, let me take that one step further. Is I do that in a broad sense, but then as I begin an investigation, usually in a verse by verse case, I look at those kinds of things as they might appear on an individual one-on-one basis. Like, so maybe it's not a very broad thing that covers the whole passage, but, oh, this one thing comes up. For instance, in verse 4 here, the Nephilim. I'm like, oh, like I want to look at what that means. And so I look at that very specifically in, social, historical, literary, religious contexts. So let me cycle one back to the literary before we leave this idea of what are the questions that I ask. I asked, what is immediate literary context? Like, what is its physical setting? But then I kind of ask it on a different angle and I say, are there other literary parallels to this passage? Like, are there other passages that are almost exactly like it? Like, are there doublets where the same story seems to be told twice? There are even ones that are known as triplets. Or if they're just thematically similar. Like, for instance, the idea that there's an encounter of a person who meets a woman at a well. There are a lot of those stories, so they're thematically similar, even if they're not identical. Okay, so what other kind of literary parallels? Are there passages that would inform this particular passage, or does this passage inform other passages?
Are you saying duplicating in the same place, or like way over in a different book?
Yes, both are possible.
Okay,
so, for instance, let me just give you two really quick examples. There seems to be a story in Genesis that happens 3 times about one of the patriarchs saying, she's my wife. No, she's my sister. No, she's my wife. Okay, so that happens 3 times, twice to Abraham and once to Isaac. Okay, and that happens all in the space of about 20 chapters in Genesis. And so those are very similar stories. And the question is, did this happen 3 times, or is this one story that somehow got attributed to, multiple times to Abraham and at least once to Isaac? So that's a question that's on the table. We're not answering it tonight. And then there's another idea where Moses and Aaron are in the wilderness and the people are like, we're thirsty, we need water. And he goes, smack, hits a rock and water comes out and they're fine. Well, that passage happens in Exodus and in Numbers. So books apart. So that's just two examples of stories that happen multiple times. And people have to ask the question, is this one story told twice or did this happen twice? So that's part of what I'm talking about.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. All right. So those are kind of all the things that I'm considering when I'm looking at any given passage, even something as short as 4 verses. Now, I want to start talking about this passage in particular, but I also want my little whiny dog to stop whining. Thank you. And magically, here she comes. 3, 2, 1.
I couldn't tell if he was as loud in here as he was.
Yeah, he's loud.
Come on, come with me. Hi. Has he been
Y'all,
fed?
yes, he has. Y'all don't try and do a Bible study on Zoom and buy a new puppy in the same time period. All right. So what are the specific points of consideration for this passage that I was thinking of, or that I read, or, was informed by others? So as a whole, I wanted to start with this thing that Billy Joy raised. This is a slightly awkward fitting place for this story. I mean, there's certain ways in which it makes complete sense, and we will talk about that, but it also feels a little weird. Because to this point, we've had the story of the first family, and ultimately we get to the genealogy of Seth, and where we're going is the continuation of that line of Seth in Noah and the huge catastrophic flood event. And that's what comes next. But in the middle of this, there's this thing that doesn't seem to reference any of those people. It's just, there are lots of people. And then there were divine beings who messed around with those people. And therefore, this was bad. So there's an awkward thematic fit. Having said that, it seems pretty clear that wherever this story comes from, wherever this tradition comes from, whoever put this in this place was making efforts to make it fit. So as I mentioned in chapter 5, among other places, it starts with, this is the book of the generations of Adam. In a day when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. So that line is starting off the genealogy, but it's also kind of referencing back in order for us to see it tied together to the first 4 chapters. And then it goes on, he created them male and female, he blessed them, and it talks about each of the antediluvian people, men usually, and when they became a father, and the name of their son, and how long they lived. Well, as we get into chapter
Corey?
6, yes.
Define antediluvian.
Antediluvian means before the flood. Anti, before, diluvian, like deluge. It's not the same word, but similar. What it does is sets this context of, now it came about, which is a nice, hey, slight reset of a new scene. Now it came about when man began to multiply on the face of the land. So this right there is thematically talking about what happened in chapter 5. Chapter 5 is listing all the people that began to multiply on the land, but this is kind of saying this and more. Okay, so when this was all happening, and then note this, and daughters were born to them. That's interesting. We're going to come back to that. All this to say, this little chunk of 4 verses is an awkward fit, but you can see the effort that has been made by the editor to kind of put it in there to smooth those edges a little bit to show that it goes with what goes before and what comes after. It fits because it shows the growth of the human race listed in Genesis 5. It mentions the daughters, that is the progeny of these early people. And that's kind of a counterbalance to all the sons that are mentioned. And then as we get through this passage, it's specifically referring to the lifespan or the reduced lifespan. And this is kind of, you have to know what had come before in chapter 5. So that's how it's connecting these 4 verses to the previous chapter. Having said that, it is a unique passage that has no direct parallels anywhere else in the Bible. So what about its theme? Nahum Sarna, I think I have mentioned, like, as long as I'm showing commentaries today, right? So Nahum Sarna, the JPS Torah commentary, I think I've mentioned this one before. Good Jewish scholar. He suggests that this is a reversal of the earlier Genesis stories where human beings were striving to rise to the level of the divine. Here, the divine beings are lowering themselves to the level of the humans. And so he sees this as a nice kind of counterbalance to the early stories as we shift into what happens next. Right? I've mentioned before that chapters 1 through 11 are this mythological chunk of material at the beginning of Genesis. Well, here we're right about at that halfway mark. And so this wrap up would give a nice balanced presentation of like Act 1, so to speak. Right? We have, in the beginning, there's this creation, and then we have humans striving towards being divine. And then to end and round this out, it's the divine striving to lower themselves to be with the humans. So that's Sarna's take on it. He also notes that because of several other mentions elsewhere in the biblical text, and just to briefly throw them out there, like Isaiah 14:12, Job 4, Ezekiel 32, among other places, this is not a specific counterbalance to polytheism. Right? This is not addressing polytheism in particular. And I don't know that we've mentioned it in this context, but Israel in its early days is not strictly monotheistic. Think we've mentioned that? We will explore that in greater depth at some point in time. Lastly, as I like to do, mentioning there is an ancient Near Eastern parallel. The Atrahasis epic mentions a human divine coupling immediately before the flood that's described in Atrahasis. So this is interesting, right? This is something that happens before a flood event in several stories in the ancient Near East, or at least in these 2. I believe it's more. So now let's take this verse by verse. Verse 1.
Okay, Corey, did you see Billy Joy's question there?
I did not.
She just asked, so he's saying the Nephilim didn't exist? It's just a story?
I haven't gotten there yet. That's verse 4.
Sorry.
No, it's quite all right. And it's always fair to ask those questions. We'll get back to it. Verse 4. So just want to start this. When men began to multiply on the face of the earth. So the word there is Adam, right? So in this case, it's not being used as the proper name Adam. It's being used generically, meaning all mankind. But it is a way to reinforce the connection to the earlier verses, because it talks about, and it was when Ha-Adam, when humanity began to increase upon the Adamah, upon the earth, 2 very important words that come in the beginning of Genesis 1 through 4. So that's part of that thematic connection, these verses to the previous stuff.
So up until this point, Eve was the only lady?
Well, no, right? Because Cain gets a wife, and obviously all these people have wives to get to this point.
Oh, I thought this was going back to describe all the before the flood. This is all after the flood.
No. We're still before the flood, but Genesis 5 is listing effectively the 10 generations that occur between Adam and Noah. And so we're kind of at this point talking about generation 9.5.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You bet. 9.87. If we want to be, no, I'm kidding. Anyway, and then what I mentioned a few moments ago, that it talks about daughters as this kind of counterbalance to all the sons that are listed in chapter 5. Well, that's really interesting The grammar even reinforces, hey, look at me, pay attention, because normally the way Hebrew works is you get a verb, then you get a subject, then you get the object. That's the standard word order in Hebrew. So verb first, subject, object. Okay? So I would say in English, I hit the baseball, right? I, subject, hit, verb, object, the baseball. But in Hebrew, the normal word order would be hit, verb, I, subject, the baseball. Okay, you following me with what I'm going there? This particular sentence reads like this. The baseball, let me just make sure I got this right. The baseball, I hit, right? And it's hard because like the verbs in Hebrew often combine the subject and the verb. Okay, so it's basically the baseball I hit. So in this case, what it literally is saying is, and daughters were born to them. So it's highlighting the daughters beforehand. This is one of those things where as you're reading, all of a sudden you stop and you go, whoop, we've changed something. Especially if you're learning Hebrew and you're like, this is a different word order than I expect. I've only learned the one sentence order. Don't change it up on me. So that's, yes, this one Yoda wrote. Very good. Right? So it's saying, slow down, pay attention to these next several verses because we're doing something different. Verse 2, the biggie, so to speak. Verse 2 starts with the B'nai Elohim. And I'm so glad that most of yours seem to say sons of God. Is that what your English translations say? What is that? Do you have any guesses?
I have been taught that it's the angels.
Okay.
Or some type of heavenly being. Maybe
Some
not.
type of heavenly beings.
Mhm.
Ancient Aliens says it's the aliens.
The aliens. Martians. Yeah. Any other ideas?
I don't know if this counts for what Billy Joyce said, but this, like, I think Megan had mentioned, like Hercules, this partially immortal, partially mortal being. I don't know that you can be partially any of those things, but you get what I mean.
I do. Okay. So it's interesting to note that there are three real ways of interpreting the B'nai Elohim, and one that is not one of those, and nobody mentioned here, was that they are literally the children of God, like God had kids. So that's what it seems to say literally, but that's not what it tends to be.
I'm really trying.
We're having a night.
It's not hard on us. It's just hard on you.
Yeah. So I preached yesterday at Harbor, and it was one of those days when my kids were walking through the screen and I can see them, and I was like, guys, you're killing me. It's all right. It's all good. So not literal children of God, although the idea that gods would have children is not uncommon. In the Greek world, we see this a lot, but we also see it in the ancient Near East as well. But that's not what's going on here. At least that's not how these words are conceptualized. So the three main ways are some sort of divine beings, whether those are angels or angel adjacent, right? There's a different word for angels that is not used here. But having said that, sometimes these B'nai Elohim can function quite similar to angels. So somebody saying angels is not like out of the realm of understanding, right? As Jim said, the heavenly host, just a bunch of minor or semi or demigods that kind of exist as part of God's retinue. like in his court, something like that. And we see that elsewhere in the Bible, for instance, in Job, Job chapter 1, right? And what's interesting about that is Hasatan, the Satan, in fact, is part of that heavenly retinue, right? He hangs out with them. Okay. We also see it in Psalm 29. We see it in other Psalms like 82 and 89, and potentially in Daniel 3. So this idea of the B'nai Elohim as divine beings is not uncommon in the Hebrew Bible. It's also something that's in the ancient Near East quite a bit.
Could you relist? I
Yeah.
was trying to type up the verses that you just said.
Yeah, so Job 1 and 2, Psalm 29, Psalm 82, Psalm 89, and Daniel 3. And that's not an exhaustive list. That's just several of the ones that are kind of easy to find. But as I was mentioning, and I think I've mentioned before, the place called Ugarit. And in Ugarit, there is a language called Ugaritic, and they've got a whole narrative history. And one of the phrases they use is effectively the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God. And it really does mean other major gods that are part of the big God, his pantheon. And the big God's name is El. Interesting. So that's one of the ways in which the B'nai Elohim are understood. A second one, and oh, I'm sorry, by the way, that was one of the first ways it was understood. Then it stopped being understood that way for a long time. But in the last 100 years, scholars have come back around to that idea as probably one of the better ways of understanding this. Then for a long time, it was understood as dynastic rulers. That is, kings. So B'nai Elohim are somehow kings. They are the child of God in that they were chosen to be rulers. We see this in some of the Psalms, for instance, that seem to have this divine kingship motif, like in Psalm 2. There are lots of references to this, so I'm not going to list them all. But again, at Ugarit, there's this king known as Keret, not the orange thing, but just K-E-R-E-T, Keret. Okay. And he is a divine king. But in his case, he's like, yes, I'm king and I'm semi-divine. So something like that. And again, that's not uncommon. Gilgamesh in the Akkadian literature is both king and semi-divine. The weird thing about Gilgamesh is he's 2/3 divine, or is it 1/3 divine? He's 1/3 divine and 2/3 human. So I'm not sure how the math works on that, but there it is. So that's the second way.
The one, I can't remember if it's a king or if it's a priest that talks about the 10%, and I don't remember what that name is, but is he considered a divine? The 10% tithe, like the original.
Oh, Melchizedek?
Yeah.
No. So he's not considered divine, at least in the biblical text. Okay. And then the third way is that somehow this refers to the line of Seth. They are the B'nai Elohim because they are godly. So the sons of God is a way of making an adjective out of God. They are godly like. And therefore, the problem is that they are marrying the ungodly Canaanites.
Wait, was this in one of the options, or is this?
Yes, that's the third way of understanding what the B'nai Elohim are, the sons of God. Okay, so those are the three ways of understanding it. Now, I'll give you my, take on this, is that due to the parallels in the ancient Near East and what the literal words say, it really does seem to suggest that they are thinking of some sort of divine beings that are not God, not fully God, but not human either. We know that ancient Israel was not monotheistic throughout much of its early history. So the idea of other divine beings beyond the main one that we worship wouldn't have been a problem for them. So it seems like the easiest way to understand it. It's backed up by a lot of data. That is, it occurs in other places, and so I think that's the one that makes the most sense. The rest of them you kind of have to twist a little bit to try and get an understanding that works. We'll unpack that a little bit more later. So the B'nai Elohim, semi-divine beings or divine beings that are not quite God. Okay. Well, what do they do? They saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. What it says quite literally is they saw that ki tov, or because it's plural, ki tovot, that they were good. So that's really interesting because I think it does two things here. It's doing a lot of work, those two words. One is it reinforces, according to Sarna, that these divine beings were driven by lust for external beauty and not for the character of the women. Okay, we want to take that with a grain of salt because beauty in the ancient world was often thought of as a reflection of character, right? It was a little more simple, right? We didn't have the notion that we have today of, oh, she's pretty, but she's mean. Oh, he's good looking, but he's a jerk, right? They wouldn't have conceptualized of it that way. They would have just thought, he's pretty, she's pretty, they must be good people. So it's a reminder too that the Hebrew Bible emphasizes physical beauty quite a bit. In Genesis, we've got Sarah, Rebecca, Leah. Throughout the text, we have Bathsheba, Tamar, Vashti, Esther. So it's not like it's uncommon for physical beauty to be a reason men are attracted to somebody without criticizing it. So there's that. But the other part, I mentioned the Hebrew specifically, ki tov or ki tovot in this case, because it both plays against Genesis 1, where God created things and it says, and he saw that ki tov, that it was good. And so here, ki tov is doing this function of God saw it was good, and overall good comes from this evaluation. But it also happens in Genesis 3, where Eve saw that the fruit, ki tov, that it was good, and that overall bad comes from it. So just saying that they saw that the women were ki tovot, that they were good looking or attractive, doesn't immediately tell us that it's good or bad. Just kind of harkens back to those other chapters. Then it says that they took wives, and it uses this phrase, they took wives. This is a standard phrase for, if they were just humans, it would be a normal marriage, right? So there is nothing implied in this that they were raped or coerced into these marriages, right? These weren't divine beings going on a rampage like Vikings and taking what they wanted and marrying them because they had to. No. They were taking wives in the same manner that human beings would have taken wives. Okay? This is further...
I have a quick question about that.
Yeah, please.
So one thing that stuck out to that verse is, I just think about the fact that a lot of the cultures, at least a lot of those, Eastern cultures tend to have arranged marriages. And it seemed like these beings were arranging the marriages themselves. And I wonder how much God was pissed about the fact that they weren't following the normal process as opposed to the fact that they were reproducing.
Okay, that's a good question. The story is not expansive. The word that I like to use, that a lot of scholars like to use, is that it's laconic. That is, it's very brief in its presentation. But there's one clue that suggests that this is fairly normal, because a common way of referring to somebody is their name, son of or daughter of something, or name from a certain place. And they give something that looks like that is proximate to that. They saw that the daughters of men. And so that seems to be standing in the place of, in a generic sense, to say, like, Sarah of Palestine, or, Leah, daughter of so-and-so, right? So daughters of men might be functioning in that way of saying, no, this is normal, right? We've identified their divine beings and that these are women who belong to, men that could have given them off in a normal marriage. One of the main reasons this is then further kind of reified as a, quote, normal marriage is the fact that there is no comment about specific force or aggression on this case. So other interpretations, maybe, but right now I think the evidence leans towards this should be understood as the problem isn't that they did it wrong, it's that they did it. Like the divine beings and the human beings got married. And that's the problem. Which is, I think, interesting as we move into verse 3. Because verse 3 says, then the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he is also flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. Okay, that seems like as Christians said, like, is this a punishment or is it just a summary statement or whatever it is? But here's the interesting part. Why doesn't it come after verse 4? Right, that's the kind of way you end a story. Do you see that? At least, whether or not you agree, at least there's this, if it stays where it is, verse 4 feels like you're resuming something. But if you took verse 3 and put it after verse 4, it would be like this nice little bow you could tie on the story. So why is it there? And Victor Hamilton, okay, I'm showing all the commentaries now. Right, New International Commentary on the Old Testament, Victor Hamilton, Book of Genesis. Okay, his suggestion is that this goes here specifically because what it wants to do is emphasize that it is the marriage that is being condemned and not the result of the marriage, which is the children. His suggestion is if they put it after verse 4, you don't know whether it's the marriage or the kids that are the problem. And he reinforces this with the idea that so much of early Israelite criticisms is in mixing unnatural pairs, right? So Israelites are not supposed to marry non-Israelites. You're not supposed to have clothing with two different kinds of fabric together. That's a problem. Humans and beasts are not supposed to mate because that's a problem. And so in a similar way, divine beings are not supposed to mate or marry humans. And so that's where the criticism lies. Sounds like one plausible explanation for how this goes. So Yahweh intercedes and he speaks, and he notes that he is withdrawing his spirit. So Ruhi, right? His spirit. This is the life force that comes from God. I mean, that's like one way of understanding it. And again, Hamilton wrote, this is interesting. He wants to juxtapose this verse all the way back to Genesis 1. And he says, the withdrawn spirit of 6:3 calls to mind the hovering spirit of 1:2, Genesis 1 verse 2. Where it hovers there is order and chaos is restrained. Where it is withdrawn, chaos flourishes unchecked. And so Hamilton's taking this very spiritual reading about like where God's spirit is, order calms chaos. And when God removes his spirit or the spirit is removed for whatever reason, chaos comes out of order. Yeah. So in this case, it seems to be the notion that God is withdrawing something, the life enabling spirit of humanity, for them to live these long, long lifespans, or at least that's the way it's conceptualized. In so removing it, he then puts kind of what's like a soft cap on the lifespan of people, right? It's 120 years now. And I say soft cap because the next several patriarchs all live past 100. And as we get into Moses lives 120. Aaron lives 123 years. And so like it's not like, on your 120th birthday, you're supposed to keel over and die. It's not a hard cap. It's a soft cap. But there it is. So the Spirit seems to be, in this case, what enables people to live these extraordinarily long lives. At least that's the way it's being presented. And he says, my spirit shall not abide. This is a weird word, doesn't exist anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. And so they've had to go to other languages to try and understand it. I don't want to linger on this word too much because, our best guess seems to be shall not like abide, shall not be present in. And it's not entirely clear because we don't have other Hebrew examples of this. So the Akkadian word dananu kind of gives us that sense to the best of our understanding.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
In verse 3, when it says God saying his spirit would not abide with them, it says because he is flesh. It seems to lead to the idea that that was always going to be the case. Like they are flesh, so there's always going to be a time when God's spirit couldn't be with them. Because, or is this the first time that they are flesh? Or does flesh mean something very specific?
So that's great. We're getting right to this point, right? Because it says, because he is also flesh. And I think that also might matter. I don't know entirely. I think you're bringing up a good point, Christian.
Wait, who's the pronoun? Because you keep saying he, but mine says they and
What says he?
who is the subject?
He, the antecedent is ha'adam, which is probably generic humanity. So they in English is a perfectly appropriate pronoun to refer back to humanity. In Hebrew, it's using who because it's referring to Adam, which is a masculine noun. Okay, so it says, but he is also flesh. So that's a really good question. Was this always the intent or was it not? I don't know that this story is answering that. And I think that's one of the threads we could pull out a little bit further if we only had a theologian in the room. But I'm a biblicist, so I'm just like, I don't know. It doesn't say. It just kind of emphasizes this notion that the idea of flesh, so to go back to Kiri's question and try and tie it to Christians, right? This idea of flesh is, the word is literally flesh, but everywhere flesh tends to be used, flesh is this emphasis of kind of the weak frailty of humanity. It's the thing that differentiates humanity from divinity. God, while humanity is made in God's image and likeness, God is divine. He might be, so to speak, superhuman, big human, right? But he's not flesh. Flesh is the reminder of our frailty and mortality, and that's what stops us. I mean, you might say in one sense that our frailty and mortality was allowed to live for 900 years in those early spaces because God's spirit abided literally within those early people. And when God says, I take that away, it's like, okay, our flesh only allows us to live 120 years because God put that cap on it. So that's what I've got there. But one
note says corrupt for mortal. What is that about?
It says corrupt?
Yeah, my footnote for
what is it referring? What is corrupt? the meaning of the word is corrupt, or
the word mortal, and it's got this little G next to it, and next to the G in the footnote says or corrupt.
So, Carrie, this is going to sound nuts. Who's the publisher of your Bible?
Oh, I don't know. I wasn't prepared. International Bible Society.
Yeah.
Is that it? Or we don't like them? I don't
No,
know.
no. IBS does some great work.
great
Okay,
question.
really,
They're a
Megan,
corrupt
you are 12.
organization.
Megan and Christian are being 12 now, but I love you. So no, they do certainly do good work. I think I'm often looking at whether we like it or not, depending on who has published it. There's usually a slant because it's English and they're making choices. Okay, Leisha's joining in with Megan and Christian, so you can all go be 12 together. Obnoxious. It's all right. We should be able to laugh in Bible study.
Wait, we're confused. We just were laughing at the question about do we not like this? We thought that was a really clever question.
That's what I thought
and
you
we're
were
going to
laughing
watch you like politically navigate that. We're
Yeah.
like,
I thought
shoot.
you meant because I said IBS.
IBS.
Oh,
no, no.
We missed that
Vowel
completely.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No.
Glad this
So
is all
here-
being recorded.
Can
So-
I ask this other question? What font is the G in? Is it like a normal G, or is it a super like Gothic looking G?
Mine is NIV and mine is an H, and it's italicized H.
I don't know what a Gothic G looks like. It almost looks like a figure 8, but squiggly.
Okay, those might just be footnotes. The reason I ask is because sometimes they will put a Gothic G in some Bibles, but highly academic ones, in order to refer to the Greek, meaning the Septuagint translated it as corrupt. But here's the issue. The word is basar. It means flesh. And what they're trying to say is the implication of using the word flesh in this instance is to refer to either physical flesh or the differentiating thing between divinity and humanity, that is mortal, or for those who might have a particular theological slant, we are corrupt versus pure and clean, which would have allowed us to be. So again, as a biblicist, I go for the most literal interpretation and then allow others to expound on that. So I'm like, it's flesh. Flesh
Corey,
here meaning not divine.
It's the theological commentary from the Septuagint. So you're exactly right in that. But and I always have to think through it. Think back to when you were in a humanities class or some history class. The Romans liked flesh, all those naked statues. The Greeks were like, ooh, spirit good, flesh bad.
What's the Septuagint?
The Septuagint is
the 70.
okay.
Go ahead, Corey.
Yeah. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that happened somewhere around the 3rd century BCE. And it's called the Septuagint because, in theory, 70 scholars took the Hebrew Bible and each on their own translated it into Greek and came up with, the exact same translation, therefore inspired by God. Okay, so that's a nice little story, but basically it's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible.
It's also, the Septuagint is what was used to translate early Bibles into English, which is where we have this long-standing tradition of things like the word flesh becoming corrupt flesh, because it was so influenced by Greek culture that hundreds of years later, we're still being influenced by ancient Greeks. And so that's where when we say, oh, you need to perhaps get, and you already know this, language changes, things shift. It wasn't anybody trying to be deceitful. It was because of power structures and who had translated what. But I would argue that that's why it says corrupt, is because of the ancient Greeks.
So
the word mortal means flesh?
Well, the word is flesh. And so what somebody is trying to say when they use the word mortal is that they're saying flesh here is connoting, that they are mortal as opposed to divine or would live forever.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here's while we were talking about how we read the Bible. So as a person who used to just not read the Bible, then I started reading the Bible. Then I started looking at footnotes, whether clicking on them or looking at them. Then I started looking at commentary. Then I started listening. It's not problematic for me per se, but I'm starting to think that we're not all reading the same things in more ways than we think. And that is a little bit scary.
Yeah. That's very true. And so one of the things I emphasize as we do Bible study is that intelligent people, well-meaning people can come to different conclusions, and that's okay. Because in all honesty, to speak from a Christian perspective, right, salvation is not determined by thinking the right thoughts. It's about relationship of humanity to God and the way we enact that. Thinking some of these thoughts might help us do that better, but I always want to be careful that we don't become thought police, because I don't think that ends up being helpful, nor is it particularly what God wants from us. So
I just wonder if it lends a hand to a lot of the division in churches, not only what the Bible says, but also what people think and how they interpret it and whatnot. And so it's funny, has the opposite effect, I think, on me now. And that's, oh, I can see why you might think that. And even if I think you're wrong, that's okay. But I'm just one person.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's the kind of humility I encourage in trying to engage the Bible. So, I've said a lot of things tonight. I might be right on some of them. I hope I'm right on some of them. But if somebody can show me that I'm wrong and wants to offer a better explanation, like in this course of 6 weeks, there have been several times where somebody has pointed something out and I think, oh, I really should think about that again. That's a good question. That's a good thought. That's a different line of thinking that might produce, more coherent answer about this passage or something like that, right? Or Christian's comment just a couple of minutes ago about like, well, wasn't this the plan all along because they were flesh? Like, because I'm looking at this passage in a particular way, that thought hadn't occurred to me, but now I want to go back and think about that. So, I don't think that there's only one way to think about these things. So let's wrap up with verse 4 before we ask some kind of overarching questions. So verse 4, Hamilton, again, I've mentioned, is kind of conservative in his take. And I think this affects what he says next. He suggests that the Nephilim in this is just this parenthetical phrase. And this is interesting because I think it matters to what we're doing here. So I want to read this parenthetical phrase. So verse 3, just to give us a run up to it, he says, "Then Yahweh said, my spirit shall not remain in mankind forever, inasmuch as he is but flesh. His days shall be 120 years. As an aside, right? The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and later on too. Whenever the sons of God had intercourse with the daughters of humankind, they fathered children by them. These were the mighty men of old, men of reputation." That's different to what we read, right? What did we read?
So wait, are the Nephilim not these people?
Aha, good question. Let's investigate. It says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, etc., etc., etc. Okay. So the question is, of course, who are the Nephilim? Let's start with their name. The Nephilim, it seems to come from the root nun pe lamed, nafal, meaning to fall. So this is why they're often known as the fallen ones. Okay, that's one way of understanding it. The grammar's a little off, and that doesn't quite seem right. But that would be a really deep in the weeds kind of explanation. So I'm not going to go there. So the question is, are they the divine beings that came down and married the daughters of men? Or are they the offspring of the encounter between the divine beings and the daughters of men? Or, as Hamilton says, some other third group, who cares? They were around, whatever. The reason I don't like that is because Hamilton doesn't explain who they are if they are just an aside comment. And so far as I know, Hamilton's the only one who's really making this argument that it's just kind of an aside comment. It doesn't, in a story that is 4 verses long, you don't have time for random asides that aren't explained. And that's what this would be if we take Hamilton's explanation. So that's why I don't buy his argument in this case. It works nicely in the sense of, grammatically it's fine, but like, what's it doing there? You have more work to do to explain this if that's the way to understand it. So I think that leaves us with the other two options. The Nephilim are either the divine beings, or they are the progeny. Okay. So I don't have a good answer. I just don't. What I have,
Are they written about in other historical writings outside of the Bible?
outside of the Bible, no. There's only one other place where I know of them. Maybe there are other places, but the only other place we know of them is in Numbers 13:33. That's it. That's the one comment. Now, it's really weird because that is when the Israelite spies are spying out Canaan before the whole group of people who are in the wilderness come into the land of Canaan. They send the spies in and they're like, oh my gosh, they're like giants. They're like the Nephilim. And we must look like grasshoppers to them. So that comment is often explained as something that is like, they weren't referring specifically to the literal Nephilim. What they were doing is, oh, we've got this conceptual notion of Nephilim being big, giant people. And therefore, they were saying they were like the Nephilim. And that's the way most people understand Numbers 13:33 anyway, is that it's this conceptual comment. Like if I were to say the Titans, right? We know of them as kind of the ancient Greek gods. They're big, they're powerful, whatever. So if I say something is, they're like the Titans or they're titanic, it means really, really big, right? Many of us might think Titanic first of the ocean liner, but the reason it was named that is because of the Greek gods, the Titans. So the idea is that this resides in cultural consciousness of the Nephilim being these big semi-divine beings that were either the divine beings that married the daughters of men or were the result. And I've got to be honest, I sat and I wrestled with this and I couldn't decide which one it was, either one. And nobody had an answer that I liked.
Well, and I've wrestled with it in seminary as well. And pretty much where most scholars stack hands is saying, this is one of those things we're probably just not going to know. And I think in modernity, which was kind of the last 100 years, people wrote books that said, no, this is what it means. In post-modernity, which is kind of where we are culturally now, people are like, there's some mystery still. Maybe we don't need to sweat bullets over some of the things that are going to remain a mystery.
So
I do think it's interesting, though, that it keeps referring to sons of God, sons of God, sons of God, and it doesn't say the sons of God were on the earth in those days. It differentiates sons of God and Nephilim in there. I just think that that's interesting that it isn't. It seems to differentiate, though that may just make me reading into it.
Yeah, no, I think you're pulling at the right thread of how we might untangle it. I think for me, it comes down to there are a lot of tantalizing suggestions, but nothing that helps me tip the scale one way or the other definitively. So in either case, though, they are wrapped up in this story as part of the group of people who do not survive the following story. And so in one sense, they're just that part of the collective cultural consciousness of those that existed back in the day before the flood. There were those who lived for a very long time. There are those who might have been semi-divine because of some sort of intercourse between divinity and humanity. And then there were those big ones, the big people. And then there were the Gibborim, which is to go back to Megan's comment a while back, right? These were the mighty men of valor, actually. This is the same word that gets used of David's mighty men. So this word, the Gibborim, seems to suggest those who had prowess physically, often exhibited in military conquest. So these are like your physical specimens, like the 300 of Sparta, that kind of thing. So they were really thought of as impressive. And so again, that might be a reflection of this note that they were semi-divine, or at least semi-divine people would result in these really powerful people. Yeah. Oh, the last thing I want to mention here is it mentions this idea. Those were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. The Hebrew seems to suggest, right? They were the Anshe Hashem, the men of the name. And why that's interesting is because those who try to establish their name in early Israelite texts are often criticized, right? Establishing one's own name is a bad thing overall. You're trying to be popular because you're important. And that's differentiated from Genesis 12:2, where God says to Abraham, I'm going to make your name great. Right? You're not doing this on your own, Abraham. That's my job. And so this might be a subtle allusion to they were men who were famous, but like that's part of the problem, right? God didn't make them great. They tried to make themselves great.
Okay, well, and so because it ties together, Kiri, this goes back to your question on yesterday, about when do you have accountability? When do you do self-promotion? How do we remain humble? And so that's certainly not the entirety of this passage, but it's woven in lots of different texts throughout Scripture that we need to be doing things because it's right, not so that people look at us and they're saying, "Ooh, look how great they are."
So let me try and put a bow on these 4 verses. This is some sort of historical memory or cultural, well, that's a little too strong. There's this cultural idea that before the flood, there were people who lived a long time. There were people who were big and powerful, like the Gibborim. There were the Nephilim, who were either divine beings or the result of divine beings marrying human people. And for all those types of people were bigger and better and lived longer like they did in the past, right? As a reminder.
Corey?
Yeah, one second. Let me just finish this thought real quick. That the past was better. The past was wonderful. And we are here because something happened going from that great, glorious, golden past to this not quite as great moment. And this is a story that explains that moment. And so that's the cultural memory that seems to exist and was told in this very abbreviated form in Genesis 6:1-4. And this sets up, in one sense, the rationale for what comes next, which is the flood. Like this is, if not the tipping point, it's the thing that pushes God to the brink that says, like this is a lot. I can't let humanity live forever because look what happens. So there we are. And that's where we're going to end this investigation for this season. But before we do, I do want to have this open question either for this passage or anything that's happened in this first thing. And we'll start with right where you were, Billy Joy, that question you were about to ask.
Yeah, I'm reading the NIV, and it says, verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and then it has a separation that says, and also afterward. And so,
Okay.
Does that mean that they did survive the flood?
So there's question about that. And I didn't really engage this point. But this idea of 120 years is taken in two different ways. One is that it is thought of conceptually as a kind of soft cap for a maximum length of life. But another way that this was understood was from that moment, humanity was given 120 years to correct itself. And then in 120 years later, that's when God was like, ugh, enough, flood time. And so they lived at that point and afterwards the next 120 years till the flood. So this and afterwards is not entirely clear, but it does suggest that they lived beyond that moment of what this story is, but nobody seems to suggest that the Nephilim lived through the flood, right? Because the flood is pretty clear that it's saying this is a full-on human reset, human, animal, earth reset. And nobody but Noah's family and the animals he took on the ark are the ones that made it. That's what the story is trying to tell.
Okay, and a follow-up question about the Nephilim.
Mm-hmm.
In the writings of Enoch, he talks about the giants that were like, that's the God had issue with them, that they were the ones that humanity had all become them in essence, and the only ones that like Noah's family was like the only ones that were no longer mixed. And I can't fully remember it, but just something to that.
No, you're exactly right. So first Enoch is the place where there is this issue of those who came down from the heavens. It's also actually in Jude, verses 4 and 5, that this cultural memory of some divine beings coming down and mixing with humanity might have remnants of it existed in the cultural memory much later. And so it's first Enoch and it's Jude. And they're both very brief, like 2 verses long, and just as opaque as the 4 verses we explored. So I have a hard time making much more of it than what we've been able to explore here. So that's what I've got, right? Yes, there is the reference there, but I don't think it actually helps. It just kind of restates what we see in Genesis 6, 1-4.
Corey, there are some other questions, but I want to be certain that you have a little bit of the conversation about feedback that you were hoping to have, so that as we plan and move forward. So I just wanted to make you aware of time.
Okay. Yeah. Any other questions, comments, or snide remarks regarding the entire 6 weeks or this week in particular?
Yeah, I think there are some people who need to slide out, so I want to be certain we do that kind of feedback.
Later?
I'll ask it a little bit differently. Leash is the one who really kind of initiated this and asked us to do it. We are acutely aware that we started with really big numbers, and that for some people, this pace and this depth has been great. For others, I think they came and went, oh, that was more than I bargained for. So we want to be honoring of people who are going to actually show up, and be certain that what is being offered is what you were hoping. And so
So let me do this. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording at this point so that we can have an offline conversation about pace and depth. Those are 2 things that I think are important as we move forward. So let me go ahead and stop the recording here. Thank you for joining us through these first 6 weeks. We'll see you in a couple of weeks as we resume with the flood narrative. That seems like a great way to start our next season of the Bible study. So until then, see you.